Numbers don't lie, but systems can be taught to. That was the first thing Christopher L. Hartwig had ever believed in. Not God, not people, not institutions. Systems. The beautiful, indifferent mathematics of logistics. Weight manifests, tonnage reports, digital load cells that recorded every kilogram of cargo that passed through the Itoke Freeport Terminal in Lekki. The numbers were always honest, even when the humans feeding them were not. Tonight, the numbers told him something was very, very wrong. Rain lashed the towering blue shipping containers of the Itoke Freeport Terminal like it had a grudge against them. The storm had been building since midnight, turning the wide concrete plazas between the stacks into shallow rivers that caught and fractured the harsh industrial floodlights. In the distance, a weather-beaten banner strapped to the administrative building snapped violently in the wind. Happy customer service. Week 2024. A relic of corporate mundanity that felt obscene against the cold, lethal stillness of the docks tonight. Christopher pressed himself flat against a damp steel support pillar, making himself as small as he knew how. His high-visibility vest, soaked through, useless now as camouflage, clung to his chest. His knuckles had gone white around the ruggedized industrial tablet in his hands. On its glowing screen, with the terminal's proprietary logistics map pulsed with a single red warning, over grid section 4. Weight 0 kilograms. A ghost container. He forced himself to breathe. Slowly, shallowly. The kind of breath that made no sound. Because less than 50 yards away, in the full wash of the floodlights, stood a man who very much did not want to be found by a system doing its job correctly. He was broad-shouldered and still, the lower half of his face masked in matte black, in a suppressed submachine gun held at the low ready. He moved with the slow, mechanical pivot of someone who had done this before, scanning the canyon of containers the way a turret scans a perimeter. Patient, thorough, certain that whatever was hiding in the dark was already dead, it just hadn't been informed yet. Behind him, rising impossibly high into the storm-gray sky, was the container, the ghost container. The system said it weighed 0 kilograms. But the armed man standing in front of it, and the two others Christopher had already counted moving through the outer grid, told a different story entirely. You do not send an extraction squad to guard empty air. You do not fly in a tactical team, jam a port's communication lines, and bribe your way through 3 layers of federal oversight to collect nothing. Zhongsik Zhong had put something in that container. Something worth killing a port auditor over on a Tuesday night in November. Christopher stared at the red warning pulsing on his screen. His fingers hovered over the terminal's crane control interface. A menu he had opened 1,000 times to resolve mundane scheduling conflicts. Never once imagining he would use it like this. If they spot me, I'm dead, he thought, watching the mercenary's slow, predatory sweep inch closer to his pillar. He completed the thought the only way a man of numbers could. But if I control the cranes, they are. He pressed his back harder into the cold steel and began to type. 3 hours earlier, Christopher had been arguing with a spreadsheet. That was the honest version of what port auditors did on storm nights. Not heroics, not intrigue, just the slow, grinding work of reconciling what the system said existed against what the physical world confirmed. Hurricane season protocol required a full grid verification every time sustained winds exceeded 40 kilometers per hour. Christopher had done it so many times that his body moved through the yard on autopilot, boots splashing through puddles, tablet raised against the rain, eyes scanning container IDs against the manifest, like a man reading a grocery list. Row A, Row B, Row C, all present, all accounted for. The terminal's automated sensors hummed in quiet agreement. He had reached grid section 4, the deep storage corridor closest to the outer fence, in where the blue Freeport containers stood in columns 5 high. When the tablet chimed, he almost ignored it. The system threw anomaly flags constantly during storms. Pressure differentials played havoc with the weight sensors, and Christopher had learned to treat most alerts as background noise. But something made him stop, rain running down the back of his collar, and actually look at the screen. Container ID FPT-7741-B, grid 4-Delta. Weight, 0 kilograms. He frowned. 0 wasn't an anomaly reading. 0 wasn't sensor drift or atmospheric interference. 0 was the system telling him, with complete, unambiguous confidence, that a container it had registered on the manifest simply did not physically exist. He looked up from the screen. Grid 4 Delta was 30 meters ahead of him, at the end of a long concrete corridor flanked by towering stacks of steel. He could see it from where he stood. FPT 7741B, a massive blue Freeport container sitting exactly where the manifest said it would be. Solid and heavy and real in the harsh wash of the floodlights. A ghost, the system insisted. A mountain of steel, his own eyes replied. Christopher walked toward it slowly, the way a person approaches something that shouldn't be there. Half convinced he was misreading the screen, half convinced the ground might give way beneath him. He stopped 10 meters short. The container was enormous. It was also unmistakably occupied. The padlock on its door was brand new. Horny and the mud around its base had been disturbed recently by something very heavy moving in. Christopher's first instinct was the right one. He took 3 careful steps backward, raised his radio, and pressed the call button. Static. He tried again, thumb grinding the transmit key hard enough to whiten the nail. The radio hissed and spat. Not the clean silence of a dead channel, but something thicker, more deliberate. A low, me-rolling interference that filled the frequency like smoke filling a room. He cycled through the secondary channels, the tertiary, the emergency band that was supposed to be hardened against exactly this kind of disruption. All of it, the same dense, purposeful nothing. Christopher lowered the radio slowly. His training, 15 years of logistics protocol, emergency procedure manuals, incident response frameworks, told him to remain calm, to locate the nearest hardline terminal, and to follow the chain of command. His body, which had apparently arrived at the truth several seconds ahead of his mind, had already stopped breathing. A comms blackout didn't happen by accident, not at a facility this size, with this much redundancy built into the network. You didn't lose every channel simultaneously from a storm. You lost them because someone who understood the system had reached into its throat and closed their fist around its voice. When he was still processing that when the man stepped into the floodlights. He emerged from the gap between 2 container stacks on the far side of the corridor. Unhurried, deliberate, as though the rain and the dark and the industrial scale of the yard were all perfectly comfortable conditions for him. Broad-shouldered, matte black tactical gear that ate the light rather than reflected it. The lower half of his face disappeared behind a gator mask, leaving only his eyes, which moved across the yard in slow, methodical sweeps that Christopher recognized instinctively as a search pattern. In his hands, a suppressed submachine gun, barrel low, trigger finger indexed and ready. Christopher did not run. Running was movement, and movement was noise, and noise was death. Instead, he folded himself sideways into the shadow of the nearest support pillar, pressing his back against cold, damp steel, and watched. The mercenary hadn't seen him. Not yet, but he was looking. Patiently, professionally, the way men who do this for a living always looked, as though finding what they were hunting for was never really a question of if, only when. 12 kilometers away, in the climate-controlled back room of a logistics consulting firm that existed entirely on paper, Jong-sik Jung was drinking tea. He preferred it unsweetened. He preferred most things stripped of unnecessary comfort. Offices without windows, conversations without pleasantries, key operations without loose variables. Sentiment was weight you carried for no return. He had built everything he owned by understanding that simple arithmetic better than the men who opposed him. On the wide monitor array in front of him, the Auditor Freeport terminal glowed in clean digital lines. His team had been inside the port's network for 11 days, long enough to reroute the weight sensors in Grid Section 4, scrub FPT 7741B from the active manifest, and install a ghost entry that told the system what Jong needed it to believe. The container did not exist. The cargo inside it had never crossed the terminal gates. By the time anyone looked closely enough to disagree, the extraction convoy would be 400 kilometers north, and the port's own compromised records would make the truth nearly impossible to reconstruct. It was, he thought, an elegant operation, Arguer, the kind that succeeded not through force, but through the manipulation of what people chose to trust. Sir, one of his hackers, young, efficient, barely worth remembering by name, turned from his console without taking his eyes from the screen. We have an active login. Terminal auditor credentials. Grid section 4. Jong set down his tea. Timestamp? 22 minutes ago. He's been running a storm check verification. Standard protocol. A pause. Should he ping the weight sensor on 7741B 4 minutes ago? Ran it twice. The room was very quiet except for the low hum of the equipment. Jong looked at the grid. At the small, blinking cursor that represented a man with a tablet somewhere in the dark and rain of his otherwise perfectly arranged terminal. A single, unscheduled variable. The only kind that had ever cost him anything. Lock the external comm, he said. Hey, all channels. Already done. Then send row team to section 4. He picked up his tea again, unhurried. The auditor is not to reach a hardline terminal. He is not to leave the yard. He paused. Make sure row understands. I want this handled quietly. The container moves in 90 minutes regardless. On the monitor, the cursor kept blinking. Christopher had spent 11 years memorizing this yard the way other men memorize scripture. Not because anyone asked him to, but because the terminal was a living system, and living systems had rhythms, and rhythms had gaps. He knew, for instance, that the automated floodlights in row C had a 4-second rotation cycle with a blind corridor on the eastern face, where the mounting bracket had been installed at the wrong angle during the 2019 expansion, and nobody had ever corrected it. He knew that the drainage channels running beneath the container stacks created a network of low, accessible crawl spaces that the port's official schematics didn't bother to label because no one was supposed to need them. He knew that the gantry crane overhead, Crane 7, the oldest in the yard, had a sensor shadow directly beneath its central track where thermal imaging returned garbage data, scrambled by the residual heat of the motor housing above. He had filed maintenance reports about all 3. None of them had been actioned. Tonight, for the first time in his career, Christopher was grateful for institutional indifference. He moved through the corridor between rows C and D at a low crouch, boots finding the narrow concrete lip above the drainage channel, keeping his weight off the standing water to kill the sound of splashing. Behind him, 30 meters, maybe less, he could hear the deliberate footsteps of the mercenary working a search grid through the stack. Methodical, unhurried. The footsteps of a man who understood that patience was a weapon. Christopher reached the eastern face of row C and pressed himself into the blind corridor. The floodlights swept past the entrance. He counted 1, 2, 3, 4, and moved again before it returned. He was 3 rows deep into the yard when he heard the second set of footsteps. They were coming from the north. Different cadence, different weight distribution. A second man cutting off the route back toward the administrative building. He stopped back against a container wall, and pulled up the terminal map on his tablet with the screen. Brightness dropped to its lowest setting. The map rendered in dim amber light, just enough to read. They were running a pincer pattern, which meant they knew approximately where he was. He thought about the crane sensor shadow. Crane 7's motor housing sat directly above Grid 3 Charlie, 60 meters northeast, are accessible through the crawl space beneath Stack 14 if you didn't mind, 40 meters on your hands and knees in standing water. He minded. He went anyway. The crawl space was exactly as miserable as he'd remembered from the one time he'd physically inspected it during a drainage audit 2 winters ago. Cold water soaked through his trousers immediately. The smell was rust and diesel and rain. He moved as fast as the low clearance allowed, tablet tucked against his chest, listening to the muffled footsteps above him shift and recalibrate as a row team lost his position. He emerged beneath Crane 7, breathing hard, invisible to thermal optics, completely alone. He allowed himself 4 seconds to feel relieved. Then he started thinking about how to stop running and start fighting back. The lights died at 2:14. Not all of them. That would have been too obvious, too complete. Jong's hackers were precise. They killed the non-essential grid first. The administrative building, the perimeter walkway lamps, the status displays mounted on the outer fence. Then, 17 seconds later, they took the row C and D floodlights, plunging the deep storage corridors into a darkness that was almost physical in its density. What remained were the emergency safety lights, low, amber, legally mandated, and the operational power running to the crane systems, which were protected by a dedicated circuit that the hackers apparently hadn't cracked yet. Christopher watched the yard go dark from his position beneath Crane 7 and understood immediately what it meant. Thermal optics worked on contrast. In a fully lit industrial yard, the ambient heat from floodlights, machinery, and sun-warmed steel created enough thermal noise to partially mask a human signature. In the dark, against cold, rain-chilled containers, a living body ran hot as a flare. They weren't cutting the power to slow him down. They were cutting it to illuminate him. He moved before the thought had fully finished forming, dropping back toward the nearest infrastructure panel. A local relay box mounted at the base of Crane 7's support column, behind a bolted steel access cover. The relay box was the crane's autonomous power node, hardwired independently from the main grid, specifically to ensure the automated systems could continue operating during outages. If the hackers found the crane circuit and killed it, Christopher lost the only weapon he was still building toward. He needed to isolate it. Manually, right now. The access cover required a key he didn't have, so he used the flat edge of his tablet case to work the bolt housing until the threading gave. A trick that should not have worked and took an agonizing 90 seconds to accomplish. Inside the relay box was a dense arrangement of circuit breakers, terminal blocks, and copper bus bars that Christopher knew in theory from the maintenance schematics he'd cross-referenced during 3 separate infrastructure audits. Theory and practice, in the dark, with wet hands, while 2 armed men recalibrated their search pattern 40 meters away, turned out to be different disciplines. He found the isolation switch on the 3rd attempt, a manual bypass toggle that would sever the crane circuit from the main network entirely, and running it instead off the crane's local battery reserve. Enough power for 2 hours of operation, maybe less if he ran the system hard. He toggled it, heard the relay click and reseat, and watched the crane's status indicator on his tablet flicker, stabilize, and return green. 30 seconds later, the rest of the crane grid went dark as the hackers found and killed the main circuit. They didn't know about the local bypass. It wasn't in the port's publicly filed electrical schematics. It was, however, in maintenance report number 7 of 31 that Christopher had submitted in 2022 and which had been logged, acknowledged, and comprehensively ignored. He was beginning to love those ignored reports. The PA system crackled to life at 2:31. It was the sound that hit Christopher first. That particular hollow click of a live microphone opening across the terminal's speaker network made a sound he had heard 1,000 times, announcing shift changes and weather warnings and the occasional all-staff memo from the port director. An ordinary sound, utterly out of place in the dark, and the rain and the silence of a yard that was supposed to be empty. Then the voice came, "Mr. Hartwig." Calm, unhurried. The faint architecture of a Korean accent beneath the perfect and expensive English. Each word placed with the deliberate care of a man who had learned long ago that he never needed to raise his voice to be frightening. Christopher pressed himself against the crane column and did not move. "I want to be clear with you," the voice continued, carrying cleanly through every speaker across the sprawling yard, bouncing between the container walls so that it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I am not angry, and anger is for people who did not plan carefully enough. I planned very carefully. You are simply a variable I am choosing at this moment to address directly." A pause. Somewhere in the dark, Christopher could hear one of the mercenaries adjusting his route, boots grinding on wet concrete, drawn perhaps by some instinct toward the sound of his employer's voice. "My name is not important. What is important is that I know yours, I know your employee number, I know the make of the tablet you are currently holding, and I know that you filed 31 maintenance reports in this terminal between 2019 and last April, of which 4 were actioned." Another pause, almost appreciative. "You are clearly a thorough man. I respect thorough men. They are useful." The rain hammered against the containers. Christopher's jaw was tight enough to ache. Here is what I am offering you, 3 million US dollars, and it transferred within the hour to an account of your choosing, and a vehicle waiting at the Eastern Service Gate that will take you somewhere the next 48 hours cannot reach you. All I am asking is that you stop. Set the tablet down. Walk east. Whatever you believe you are defending tonight, this terminal, this system, this idea that the numbers are supposed to mean something, I am telling you, as someone who has purchased every system he has ever needed, now that it is not worth your life. The microphone stayed open for a moment longer. When Young spoke again, the warmth had not left his voice. That was the most frightening thing about it. You are a man who believes in order, Mr. Hartwig. So am I. The difference between us is simply that I am the one providing it tonight. Think carefully. You have until my convoy reaches the gate. The PA clicked off. The yard returned to rain and darkness and the distant sound of boots on wet concrete, moving closer. Christopher looked down at the tablet, at the crane interface, still green, still live, still waiting. He thought about $3 million for exactly 4 seconds. Then he started building the trap. Christopher had built his entire career on the premise that systems worked when people respected them. That was not naivety. He had never been naive about human nature. He understood that people lied, cut corners, buried discrepancies in footnotes. It let maintenance reports accumulate like sediment at the bottom of an inbox. He had spent 11 years documenting exactly that, but the system itself, the weight sensors, the manifests, the load cells, the immutable mathematics of cargo logistics, that was something different. That was the thing that couldn't be bribed or threatened or worn down by institutional fatigue. The numbers were always honest. Jung had just told him, with complete sincerity and $3 million, that even that was something he could buy. Christopher sat with that for the 4 seconds he'd allotted himself. Then he thought about what was actually inside FPT 7741B, because Jung hadn't said, and the things you didn't name were usually the things you couldn't afford to have named. He thought about the extraction convoy moving toward the terminal gates. He thought about the weight of the padlock on that container door, brand new and expensive, and the depth of the mud displacement around its base, and what kind of cargo required this many armed men and this much corrupted infrastructure to move quietly through a Nigerian port at 2 a.m. He thought about the 31 maintenance reports, the 4 that were actioned, the 27 that weren't. He had always believed the correct response to a broken system was to document the failure and trust the process. To flag the anomaly and wait for someone with more authority to act on it. That was the rule. That was the protocol. That was the flaw he now understood, that Jung had counted on when he'd chosen this terminal. This night, this particular auditor, working a storm check alone. Jung had built his operation on the assumption that a man who believed in order would wait for permission to defend it. Christopher opened the crane management interface and looked at it. Really looked at it. Not as a scheduling tool, not as a logistics aid, but as what it actually was. Direct, authenticated control over 14 automated gantry cranes, each capable of moving 40 tons of steel with the precision of a surgeon and the indifference of a machine. He thought about the terminal map, the convoy's only viable exit route, the geometry of the container stacks in sections 2, 3, and 4. He began to see it the way he saw a weight discrepancy, as a problem with a solution hiding inside the numbers, waiting for someone to read them correctly. He was still unarmed. He was still outnumbered. He was still crouched in the dark beneath a crane in a rain-soaked, high-visibility vest that made him, in almost every conventional sense, the least dangerous person in this yard. He began to type. The first crane woke above him with a low, resonant groan of steel and hydraulics. And Christopher Hartwig, auditor, rule follower, filer of ignored reports, started building a maze with no exit. The cranes did not wake gently. That was the thing nobody who hadn't stood beneath one at full activation truly understood. The sheer, overwhelming physicality of the machines. The technical manuals describe them in dry engineering language. Gantry cranes, rail-mounted, automated, 40-ton capacity, variable traversal speed. Numbers on a page. What the manuals did not convey was the sound of the motors engaging across an entire yard simultaneously, a deep sub-bass resonance that Christopher felt in his back teeth before he heard it with his ears. Or the way the overhead rail structure vibrated, shedding collected rainwater in long silver curtains that fell through the amber emergency lighting like something biblical. Or the way, he imagined, that sound carried to every armed man currently hunting him through the dark. Good. He wanted them to hear it. He wanted them to understand, in the most visceral possible terms, that the nature of this problem had just changed. Christopher moved as he worked, keeping the crane column at his back, tablet angled away from the yard to kill the screen glow. The management interface had been designed for logistics supervisors operating from a climate-controlled office, not for a rain-soaked auditor running manual overrides from a maintenance crawlspace. In it showed the command latency was higher than he needed, and twice in the first 3 minutes the system threw authentication challenges that forced him to re-enter his credentials with fingers that had gone stiff with cold. But the cranes responded. That was what mattered. Crane 7, his crane, the one whose local battery reserve he'd isolated, moved first, its trolley traversing east along the overhead rail with a sound like slow thunder. Then Crane 4, in the northern section of the yard, its spreader bar descending toward a stack of containers in grid 2, with the ponderous, unstoppable patience of something that had never once in its operational life been asked to hurry. Then Cranes 9 and 11, further south, their motors building to a combined frequency that Christopher felt vibrating up through the concrete and into the soles of his boots. Across the yard, the search pattern broke. He could hear it, the change in the mercenaries' footsteps, the way the measured professional cadence stuttered and reassembled into something less certain. They had trained for human opponents, for variables that could be outrun or outgunned or cornered against a wall. They had not trained for the possibility that the walls themselves would start moving. Christopher pulled up the terminal map and overlaid the crane positions against the convoy's projected entry route. The geometry was beginning to take shape. Not perfectly, not yet, but enough. A narrowing, a channeling. The early architecture of something that, if the convoy arrived when Jung had promised, and if the cranes performed within their rated tolerances, and if his hands stopped shaking long enough to input the next sequence correctly, might actually work. 14 giants were awake above him, waiting to be aimed. He aimed them. He heard the convoy before he saw it. 3 vehicles. He counted by the engine signatures. The way the diesel rumble of each truck arrived in a slightly different register through the wet concrete beneath him. Heavy vehicles running dark, no headlights. They came through the Eastern Service Gate at 2:47, which meant Jong had moved the schedule forward by 13 minutes, which meant either the operation was ahead of plan or Christopher's crane activations had accelerated something. Neither possibility was comfortable. He pressed flat against the Stack 14 support column and watched them roll into the yard. The trucks were matte gray, unmarked, riding high on reinforced suspension that absorbed the uneven terminal road surface without complaint. The kind of vehicles that existed in a category between commercial and military, available to people who needed capability without insignia. Each one was large enough to swallow a standard shipping container through its rear cargo doors. And as Christopher watched the lead truck arc toward grid section 4, he understood with cold clarity exactly how thoroughly this operation had been engineered. The truck's dimensions were not accidental. They had been matched precisely to FPT 7741B's load specifications. Someone had measured this container a long time before tonight. The convoy stopped 30 meters from the ghost container. Doors opened. 6 more men in tactical gear dropped to the concrete. Calmer than the row team hunters, even more focused, the deliberate efficiency of personnel whose job was extraction rather than pursuit. One of them moved immediately to the container's padlock with a key that turned on the first attempt. The doors swung open. Christopher's tablet buzzed softly. The weight sensor in grid section 4, still functional on its isolated circuit, registered a change as the container doors shifted the structure's load distribution. FPT 7741B. Weight 847 kilograms, not zero, never zero. Whatever was inside, and it had mass, and it had density, and it was real. And in approximately 4 minutes, the extraction team would have it loaded and moving, and Christopher would have nothing but a tablet, 14 cranes in motion, and a geometry problem he hadn't fully solved yet. Through his earpiece, the lead specialist's earpiece, the one Christopher had retrieved from the drainage channel 12 minutes ago after the man had made the terminal's last fatal mistake of stepping over a crawl space access point. He heard a voice check in from one of the trucks. Road 2, how's our auditor? A pause. Still looking. The specialist's voice somewhere in grid 3. He's not on thermals. Must be in the infrastructure. Leave him. Cargo first. We're 4 minutes to load. Christopher looked at the terminal map. At the convoy's position, at the crane positions, and the container stacks in sections 2 and 3, and the single viable exit route running back toward the eastern gate through a corridor that was, at this precise moment, still open. 4 minutes. He had designed the trap to close in 3. He started the sequence. The first container dropped at 2:51. Christopher had chosen it carefully. Stack 9, grid section 2, a 40-ton block of blue steel that Crane 4 had been holding in position for 6 minutes, spreader bar locked, waiting for the command. He sent it with a single input, a routine drop instruction indistinguishable from any other automated logistics operation, and watched on the terminal map as the indicator moved from suspended to placed. The sound it made contacting the concrete was not subtle. He had anticipated that. The extraction team would hear it and know in the same instant, and that something had changed in the geometry of the yard around them. That was acceptable. What mattered was not surprise. That window had closed when the cranes first woke. What mattered was sequence and speed, and whether he could close the corridor faster than 3 trucks could accelerate through it. He sent the second command before the echo of the first impact had finished bouncing between the container walls. Crane 9, Stack 11, Grid Section 3, a container placed not across the road, but at a 45-degree angle to it. The spreader bar rotated to maximum traverse before release, so that the container landed skewed across the junction between the exit corridor and the Northern Service Road. Not a clean wall, a wedge, impassable to a vehicle moving at speed, more so to one that tried to reverse out of it. On the earpiece, the voices changed register. What was that? Stack drop, Section 2. A pause, is shorter than it should have been. Section 3 just moved. Row lead, we have crane activity on the exit route. Then the lead specialist's voice, sharper now, the professional calm acquiring an edge. Load faster. All teams, load and move, now. Christopher was already on the third command. Crane 11, the southernmost unit in the active sequence, traversing a container across the mouth of the Eastern Service Gate approach. The last choke point, Shuana, the throat of the only route back to the outside world. It was the longest move in the sequence, the crane arm traveling its full horizontal range, and the latency in the management interface had not improved, and his hands were still not entirely steady. And he watched the progress indicator crawl across his screen with a focus so complete that he forgot for 4 full seconds to breathe. The truck's engines ignited. He could hear them across the yard. The deep, urgent bark of heavy diesel under sudden acceleration, the sound of the convoy trying to compress 4 minutes of loading into 90 seconds of panic. The Crane 11 progress indicator reached 100%. The container dropped. The sound was immense and final. And when Christopher pulled up the terminal map and saw the corridor geometry, Stack 9 sealing the north, Stack 11 wedging the junction, a Crane 11's load sitting squarely across the gate approach, like a period at the end of a sentence, he exhaled for what felt like the first time since the PA system had clicked off. The convoy was still inside the yard. It was not getting out. The yard went very quiet after the gate sealed, not silent. The crane still groaned overhead. The rain still hammered the container walls. The truck engine still ran with the anxious idle of machines whose drivers had not yet accepted what the geometry was telling them. But the frantic radio chatter on the earpiece died away, replaced by something worse than noise, the particular, pressurized quiet of professionals recalculating. Christopher was already moving, pulling back from Stack 14 toward the central service corridor. The spine of the yard, running north to south between the container walls, the one position from which the crane interface could reach every remaining active unit in the network. His boots found the narrow concrete lip above the drainage channel by memory now. He moved without the tablet's map, navigating by the internalized schematic of 11 years, the yard existing in his mind as cleanly as a spreadsheet. He heard the lead specialist before he saw him. "Honey, he's running the cranes from somewhere central." The voice in the earpiece was stripped of everything now except function. "Grid intersection, the spine corridor. Find him." Footsteps, fast and deliberate, converging from the north and east simultaneously. They had stopped hunting and started calculating, and a man who calculated in straight lines would reach the spine corridor in under a minute. Christopher pressed into the shadow between two container stacks and pulled up the crane interface. His hands had stopped shaking. He wasn't sure exactly when that had happened. The terminal map showed him everything. The convoy stationary and sealed in Section 4. The two truck crews still at the container, unable to load and unable to leave. And the lead specialist, identifiable by the earpiece signal, which Christopher had spent 20 minutes triangulating, moving through Grid 3 on a direct line toward the spine corridor's northern entrance, toward Christopher's position. He pulled up Crane 7, his crane, the one running on the isolated battery reserve, the one whose sensor shadow had hidden him from thermal imaging 3 hours ago, the one that had been holding a single container in traversal suspension above Grid 3 for the last 11 minutes, waiting. He watched the specialist's approach on the map, 50 meters, 40, 30. The timing required the kind of precision that logistics, as a discipline, had always demanded of him. Not guesswork, and not approximation, but the clean, accountable certainty of a man who understood exactly what the numbers were telling him. 20 meters. The specialist stepped into the mouth of the spine corridor. For one moment he was visible, a dark silhouette in tactical gear at the far end of a canyon of blue steel. Weapon raised, moving with the controlled aggression of a man who had found what he was looking for. He looked directly at Christopher's hiding spot. Christopher hit the command. Crane 7's container came down between them like a guillotine. 40 tons of blue steel meeting concrete with an impact that Christopher felt in his spine and his sternum and the fillings in his back teeth. The shock wave of displaced air arrived a half-second later, hot and enormous. The corridor sealed. The earpiece went silent. Christopher stood in the ringing, rain-soaked aftermath and looked at the wall of steel in front of him, unmarked, immovable. And the terminal map showed the specialist signal stationary on the other side of it, alive, contained, going nowhere. In the distance, finally rising above the rain and the crane noise and the idling trucks, sirens, the fail-safe alarm he had triggered 40 minutes ago, routed through the isolated crane circuit to the Port Authority's emergency network, had found someone to answer it. Christopher leaned against the container wall and slid down it until he was sitting on the cold, wet concrete, on a tablet resting across his knees, the crane interface still open and green and fully operational. He had not fired a single bullet. He did not own a single bullet. He was a port auditor who filed maintenance reports that nobody read, and he had just buried a mafia extraction operation under 40 tons of blue steel, using nothing but 11 years of ignored expertise and a management interface designed for scheduling freight. He sat there listening to the sirens grow louder and thought that the numbers, in the end, had been honest about everything. Dawn came slowly over Lecky, the way it always did after a storm, not as a sudden brightness, but as a gradual gray lightening of the sky above the container stacks. The darkness thinning by degrees until the blue of the Freeport containers became visible again, vivid and enormous against the washed-out morning. By the time the light was strong enough to read by, the yard was full of people, Port Authority officers, federal agents in unmarked jackets who had arrived in the third wave and immediately begun speaking to each other in the clipped, proprietary shorthand of men who dealt in things that didn't appear on official manifests. A forensic team working the ghost container with methodical care, cataloging what was inside it with the same patient thoroughness that Christopher had spent 11 years applying to cargo weights and load distribution records. Photographers. A woman from the port director's office who had not yet looked Christopher in the eye. Two of row team, zip-tied and seated against a container wall with the particular stillness of people who had run out of options and were now performing cooperation. The lead specialist had a broken collarbone from the container's pressure wave. He was being loaded into an ambulance as Christopher watched, still saying nothing to anyone, which struck Christopher as a kind of professional discipline he could almost respect. Almost. A federal agent had taken his statement at 4:30, his tablet as evidence at 4:45, and returned a cup of terrible coffee at 5:10 without being asked, which Christopher appreciated more than he would ever articulate. He stood now at the edge of grid section 4, hands wrapped around the cup, looking at FPT 7741B. The container doors were open. The forensic team moved in and out of them with the numbered bags. The terminal map on the officer's workstation, Christopher could see it from here, showed the container's weight reading clearly. Not zero, had never been zero. He thought about what Jung had said on the PA system, that Christopher was a man who believed in order, that the difference between them was simply a matter of who was providing it. He had meant it as a seduction, as a logical proof that the two of them were more similar than different, that the step from auditor to asset was a small and rational one. What he had misunderstood, what men like Jung always misunderstood, Christopher thought, was that a system's integrity was never a property of the system itself. It was a property of the people who showed up to defend it at 2 a.m. in the rain, with no weapon and no backup and 31 maintenance reports that nobody had read. The system was only as strong as the person who refused to walk away from it. Yet he finished the terrible coffee. Around him, the terminal was beginning its ordinary morning. Crane operators arriving for the day shift, a cargo vessel visible on the horizon, the first automated check-in pings appearing on the restored network. He would need to file an incident report, a thorough one, the kind that left nothing out, that documented every anomaly and every failure point and every maintenance deficiency that had been ignored long enough to nearly cost this port everything. In the kind of report that people would actually have to read this time. He picked up a replacement tablet from the operations desk, opened a new document, and began.